And my name is Ross Barney. I'm going to introduce the 2023 Richard F. Hansen lecturer, Andrew Schachman. Andrew Schachman is a Chicago-based educator and designer of environments, infrastructures, and installations. He is the executive co-director of two organizations that are experimental spaces for delivering arts and culture within existing metropolitan networks, Fieldwork Collaborative Projects, and Floating Museum, which is currently curating the 2023 Chicago Architecture Biennial. Trained as an architect, Andrew designed and managed projects for the offices of Zaha Hadid, Perkins and Ross Barney, and Doug Garofalo. His projects have received numerous awards, including the Distinguished Building Award from the American Institute of Architects and the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation Award for Architectural Excellence in Community Design. Andrew is currently a lecturer in urban design at the University of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Andrew. And we'll start with the Hansen Awards announcements, or
let's end with the Hansen Award, because that's okay.
So nobody leaves beforehand.
Yeah. And I'll try to make this peppy and lively. There's a little bit of precariousness in the setup, which actually I confess is my favorite thing ever, because a lot of our practice is live attunement with others. So also Peter will be running the adjacent slideshow, and maybe we'll have happy accidents. I don't know. So one thing before I begin, things I won't show you today. I'm not showing you my own design practice independent. I have a architecture and exhibition design and curation company. So like right now I'm doing some work at O'Hare International Airport. These things I won't show you, but they inform and my ability to get the things done that and experience working with municipal authorities, experience with budgets, experience working with engineers, help with the things I will show you today. And I'm going to open and close with the same little paragraph, actually. It's from Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream, and I sort of like it within the Western canon that there's this loophole. So in the play, these two characters are talking, and Hippolyta says, there are these lovers out there hallucinating, and Theseus says this famous quote, which was the first exhibition I ever produced in the city of Chicago, in the public space, that what they're seeing is more strange than true, which was the title of our exhibition, in a public park, thinking about public space as a potential platform for a cultural production in a way that in the city of Chicago is not so easy to produce. But then Hippolyta says, yeah, it is strange, but they're all seeing the same thing. They're all seeing the same phenomenon, these lovers, and we should take them seriously, essentially. I think this is sort of within a tradition of Western architectural, U.S. architectural dominance, the idea that we could share a hallucination about another way that the world works within that system, and then start to see potentially that the Western system is also a hallucination imposed on the land and on our lives, is really motivates me in my entire practice. This diagram on the left, or painting on the left, is Piet Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie. I don't know if you know the painting. It influenced a lot of Dutch architecture. When Villa Rens came to teach at IIT, where I taught for 13 years, I proposed this as a way of thinking about our curriculum, because Piet Mondrian didn't finish it necessarily. He died, and no one really knows in what state it's in. So, even if you added another blue square, this structure would still hold and be coherent. So it's a kind of open framework, organizational idea that inspired people like Hermann Hertzberger in the way they think about architectural organization, like a system that's open enough to absorb other things. However, I found these, people were trying to understand where he was in the process of painting, and I found these X-rays, which are an analysis of the layers of paint, the accrual of paint on the surface. And it dawned on me that this is more the way I see the city than that the city is an open-ended process, not an object. It's something we have a relationship to, not a field of constellation of objects of capital production. And if you think about it, the city destroys itself in order to reproduce itself constantly. I mean, this is how capital and capital value is produced. The city reproduces a set of values over and over and over across generations. In Chicago, in particular, we have different scales of this kind of destruction. So this is from the area of the Chicago fire, which annihilated, based on a myth of a cow kicking over a candle. Not true. I think it was some people who got really drunk and started a fire. But annihilated an entire district, which reorganized Chicago's history. You can see this. These are views from Water Tower Place, which is in the shopping district, but was the fire protection tower. So it had water, so it didn't burn. But people went and made these, I can't remember what they're called now. They were like little toys when we were children. Stereoscopes, Panavision, something like that, or something like that. Panoscope. So you could simulate and occupy the space of this annihilation of the city. So it's pretty intensive annihilation. And then, as a way of building themselves out of that, this like phoenix that rises out of its own ashes, which is actually the logo of University of Chicago, where I teach, was the World's Columbian Exposition, which reimagined a city in its own, in the space of its own destruction. And, you know, The Devil in the White City, a lot of these novels that you might read now relate to this whole image of production, but it's rehearsing a city. These are plaster buildings. They are not stone. Sculptures were made in plaster. So it was all temporary, designed to be temporary, an ephemeral kind of walk-in city environment. Ironically, it had its own fire and was destroyed. So there's this kind of microcosm within the rehearsal of its own destruction, which I find endlessly interesting. In parallel, however, there are slower destructive changes. So this is a very expansive, massive one. Oh yeah, please be out of sync. I like out of sync. Oh, mysterious images. Okay. I taught in a building at IIT, which is Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall. It's like this, the temple of Mies van der Rohe's. People who love Mies think of it as the pinnacle of some of his architecture. But that building replaced a building in an area called Bronzeville, which was called the Mecca, which is the subject of Gwendolyn Brooks, who was the poet laureate of the United States many years ago. It was a subject of her preoccupation in poetry for some time. She worked in that building. Jazz was produced there. There's myths about Louis Armstrong sleeping there a few nights when Bronzeville was actually bigger than Harlem in New York, producing a lot of what you recognize as American culture, actually. That building, IIT, the Illinois Institute of Technology, disinvested in it intentionally in order to justify its removal. So it was destroyed, collapsed into its own foundations, and Crown Hall was built in its place by some Europeans who came over because of the kind of ravages of World War II. There was a day where I was working, and the publications office called and said, "You need to get down here. They're repairing the steam tunnels." And this was the view. There was a hole in the ground, and you could see the basement of the Mecca intact, 8 feet below the surface of the really pristine lawn. The school didn't really want to actually deal with this because they have a tense history with Bronzeville. They are responsible for a lot of human tragedies in Bronzeville, and they did not want to open this conversation up. But community ended up showing up anyway for a big public event. So this is a lot of, it was only open for about 21 days. So I went down there and grabbed as many things as I possibly could because I knew it was like an archaeology of the recent past. But it opened up an impression for me. You know, whenever you see these pictures of Mies van der Rohe, like in repose, smoking a cigar in Crown Hall, these are very famous series of photographs. I can't help but think, you know, just below his feet is this other history collapsed into its own foundations. And this opened up a whole, this is before our floating museum began. This opened up a whole trajectory in my mental ecology about the layers, even in a city like Chicago, which is only a couple hundred years old, in its Western incarnation, right? We talk about the origin of a city often like we talk about the origin of colonial settlement, but that city is also thousands of years in development before the presence of colonists, DuSable. And I want to talk about that too. So this is part of the opening up another hallucination about the land, which we talked about in the workshop that we are finishing today. This, you can go on, this is like Wikipedia. It's called native-land.ca. And it shows you Canada. It shows you the territories in the United States that were indigenous. If you notice, they are translucent overlapping plates. There is not a definite boundary between them. It's a lot of overlapping layers of territory, or really, really zones of nomadic operation. So that's Chicago. That's where I live. Lots of overlap. Ojibwe, Potawatomi. And these are treaties. And if you notice, these are treaties made with the United States as colonizers came and asked for people to cede. Often there was natural resources that people from Great Britain, Netherlands wanted, and requested that people cede some of the ownership of the land in exchange for temporary use of hunting, fishing. The treaties vary depending on how aggressive the United States wanted to be and to claim natural resources. Of course, all of these were forsaken through a process that happened before treaties were made and after and during the process of treaty making. So we were talking about a kind of analogy. If I came in and measured your house, I just knocked on the door and said, I'm going to measure your apartment, and then later I show up with a treaty and say, you're going to give me rights to this room, but you can still cook in your kitchen. This is sort of like an equivalent feeling that you might have if you think about it from another point of view. So people came in with a process for disposing the land and a way of measuring it with initially a chain, a Guntner's chain. There's something ironic and beautiful and terrifying about this idea that a landscape is kind of subjected through a chain to a new order. And that's the chain. It has these little insignia that mark distances, literally used like a drawing device in the land to triangulate and measure squares. All over the United States, and as an art practice, we're really interested in monuments, but these are called monuments by surveyors, but they mark points of origin for the survey. So if you imagine the original, what we call the original 13 colonies of the United States, if you look on the map, immediately to the east is an Indian, a land reserve for indigenous tribal life that was pushed out of the colonies. And very shortly after, from Ohio all the way to California, a process unfolded because at the time, the U.S. government, many of you probably know this, there wasn't property taxation yet. So to raise money for this new fledgling government conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, needed to raise money. So it forsook treaties, transformed that into temporarily public domain in preparation. Well, that process is a process of drawing and a miraculous process of field notes. So imagine like a Richard Long art practice, someone walking through the landscape in 1795 to 1830, actually noting what they encountered. So imagine thousands of people migrating and surveying the landscape and also making, based on their mental ecology, whatever they thought was important, the script of observation. In Illinois, I got there in 1987, and I don't know, I think I lived there for 20 years before I even heard about, this is Cahokia. So Cahokia is a pre-Columbian settlement just northwest of St. Louis, near the Mississippi River. 60 acres of mounds. This mound is humongous. If you stand on it, you see the St. Louis Arch, and you see a landfill in between you and the arch. And it's almost like layers of human transformation of the landscape over 3,000 years, all in linear succession between the Cahokian mound and the arch. But no one even bothered to mention, I mean, this site is like Rome in the United States, and no one bothered to mention it to me when I arrived in Chicago. You would think it would be one of the most important sites we have in the United States, but it's like underrepresented in our history. But if you go and look at the ordinance, the person who surveyed this landscape didn't even bother to make note of 1,000 mounds in a 60-acre territory. It says something about the mental ecology of somebody surveying the landscape at that period. After surveying, that land was disposed through a succession of sales. And these land offices, which are just kind of very simple architectural structures, pop up. They're not meant to be extremely complex, ornamental kind of buildings. They're very performative architectures, expedient, quick, and people lined up to claim land. So the United States turned it into public domain, and then immediately turned it into a kind of myth of privatization. And thank you in our seminar, I've seen these plots. So if this is Iowa, and you can see in the grid, and then you can see claims. So as you got your ticket for sale, you would have a legal description formalized. Your name is put on a plot, and now it's updated into parcels. If you were indigenous, this is a very strange proposition for someone to come from another place, measure, assign land as public domain. And we should talk about, in this context, what we mean by public, because I think we talk about like public and private in architecture sometimes. I think it's helpful to think about the fact that public means owned by the government, private means owned by an individual, which is different than a civic realm or an open free space where you can think about the production of what you want to do with colleagues. Area 57, where the UFOs are, that's public property. O'Hare International Airport, where I need to get badging in order to install art in a Homeland Security space, is public property. So it opens up questions about what we really are thinking about when we talk about public versus collective space or space of free operation. And in Illinois, this structure, you can feel it you can feel it here in the structure of the farm land and county roads, and you can feel it in Chicago, even to the size of my house. There's like 24 lots to a block, and there are 16 in one direction, 8 in the other, and my house is some kind of fractal-like expression or index of this whole surveying system. It's a dark map, projecting, but once that private, are you familiar with the Noli map of Rome? It's a kind of figure-ground relationship. So if you imagine this that way, these lines, which are now county roads, sometimes a river, as that privatization process happens, it kind of pressurizes and squeezes the public domain down to these trajectory zones. Trajectory for water to flow, trajectories for farms and cars to move through the landscape before, say, the freeway system is imposed later. There are really two kinds of space here dominantly. There's owned by the government, owned by private individuals. There really isn't a third zone, occasionally. And that's really partly the interest of Floating Museum, actually. This is Kansas, so you can see this indexed All right. No, that's great. You can see that indexed. It almost looks like a painting, but it doesn't look like the geology that you would expect a natural landscape to look like. And most of the United States looks like this. So what is the effect of this on our mental ecology? We live inside of this world, not just looking at it from a cartographic point of view. We were talking yesterday that you could think of this like it is both the scene of the crime and a way of, crime scene detectives will use this gridded organization in order to thoroughly locate evidence of a crime. But also the grid, in a way, in this case, is part of the crime, in a way. And my undergraduate education is in cultural anthropology, so I also think of it as I worked in Altamira with these imposing strings to recover artifacts for a summer. It's also the way archaeologists find evidence in a landscape. So it's both a system of imposing power, sort of like a crime scene investigation, and a way of retrieving evidence of our past and collecting artifacts. I think Roland Barthes would reject this today, but I still think of it as very useful. So I took like 2 years of semiotics and linguistics, so I think about this a lot. But the way we encode the landscape, we have things that signify social contracts imposed into our world, and now they're really entangled in the landscape itself. And for Barthes, he would talk about a double order sign. So say you have the word cowboy, and it engenders an image of a cowboy. If you're Marlborough, you take that sign and add this other myth of Horatio Alger and muscular American power. You forget the fact that the cowboy was modeled on British knights. You skip right over it, so you see now cowboy as a signifier of American muscular power. And you forget all of the contingencies of the actual conditions. So you're kind of leapfrogging over a set of contingencies in the way you construct the mental ecology of the landscape. And it's almost like having to peel back layers of an onion and think about the presuppositions. Manifest destiny is a presupposition of colonizers, accepting the lifting of treaties, accepting the idea of a public domain, accepting the idea of property replacing a public domain, accepting that the conversion from public domain to privatization, accepting the idea that, I don't know if you've read Max Weber, through the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism, that somehow working the land is a way of liberating yourself in a capitalist and democratic economy, accepting that. And slowly you realize we live in this very entangled mental ecology. And I think, I'm not saying necessarily that this opens up just a lot of questions for architectural practice, which tends to reproduce capitalism. We aid and abet the capital process. It also opens up questions for art, for opening up new aesthetics, for helping us indulge in our hallucinations and try to figure out our position in relation to them. You don't know me so well, but I have like 25,000 pictures of the ground in my phone. And it's because I am obsessed with the manufacture of the ground. Personally, in my own practice, it happens in architectural practice. You start out designing buildings, and then you start looking at the horizontality of the site and thinking about the relationship between architecture and landscape. I did some digging. There's different myths about the origin of street markings, but one is that a bicycler named Edward Hines in Michigan was following a milk truck and watching it drop milk on the street and thought, we could regulate our behavior by putting a social contract in paint on the surface of the tar. This is one of my favorite scenes of a movie. North by Northwest, Cary Grant. Just inches from a bus moving away from him. now in the expanse of, I think, probably the Southwest somewhere. And there is something comic about it, and for me, especially living in a dense city, it's like it's almost preposterous. This plane trying to attack someone in a landscape, but and mostly because our lines system are a kind of social contract encoded into the surface, which create and allow for a lot of density of different objectives. I am always aware that I'm sometimes standing at a bus stop and cars are careening by me 3 feet from my body. So whenever I see the Cary Grant scene, it's like, this is preposterous compared to what I pretty much tolerate in the city because of my reliance on this mental ecology that the car is not going to just veer, hit me, drop, jump the curb and take me out. And so it allows for a kind of densification through agreement. This is a video of someone analyzing New York intersections, and you can see these like behaviors get expressed. So when it lights up red, there's kind of conflicting danger happening. And one thing you're aware of is just these people moving in a landscape. You're aware that they're, you would say, not a great driver. Well, what does that mean? That means they're not a great driver relative to the agreement that is implicit in our kind of ambient environment through codes. This produces a whole other set of research. This is Bill Bunge from Detroit, using cartographic analysis to understand the impact of these on communities. So, for example, where at these social agreements does racism express itself in increased collisions in the landscape due to poor maintenance and poor policing and poor design? Or how do flows of resources start in a central business district and trickle out horizontally into other communities in Detroit because of the structure of where business invests? And so in that context, Floating Museum is not an actual building. It's a practice of a collective of people that share a common hallucination, and we drift around the city, look at the history of sites, and create temporary activations to try to, detour the existing structural system. I would say we're more of an adjacent model than an oppositional model. So we're trying to seduce people through aesthetics to change behaviors. Our process started in the Chicago Park District, which is the weirdest space. I don't know if there's a precedent for it elsewhere exactly as it's instantiated. It is a quasi-governmental, separate governmental entity in the city of Chicago. A mayor can't sell off that land to get a kickback from a developer to support an election. There's a separate governmental authority. So it is somewhere between private and public realm. It is government owned, but kind of pushed away from the mayoral power. It's fascinating. It has 600 sites and 437 field houses. It is like a country within the city of Chicago. And so because of that, I think intuitively it was the first place where we started to rehearse our practice. I'll skip over this part, but we really are interested in museology and questioning kind of the colonial aspect of museum practice and thinking about it a little differently. We really love this book by Claire Bishop, A Dialectical Contemporaneity. You know what I'm saying. Thinking a little differently about our relationship to museums as institutions where rather than thinking about the museum as the table, we are all at a shared table, and the museum is just another person that needs nourishment, along with all the citizens of the city of Chicago. And it started actually at the DuSable Museum of African American History, which was started ad hoc by a woman named Margaret Burroughs, who realized that African American cultural contributions needed to be contained somewhere and permanently stored in the city of Chicago for African Americans living in Chicago to understand their relationship, deep relationship to American history and the production of American social culture and music and all kinds of science. But people dropped off random elements from the community on her front porch. So the collection is not a museum of objects of capital value. It's a museum of objects of equivalent cultural value. And this totally changed our thinking about museology and structure. So you'll see like a Elizabeth Catlett sculpture and the first Black Barbie in the exhibition. You'll see a Richard Hunt sculpture and a horn, powder horn from the Civil War from a soldier, African-American soldier. Or you'll see a shovel, which is a utilitarian tool painted, or a really, $1 million painting, all next to each other in the archives. And this opened up a practice for us. So our first project was in the Chicago Park District. We thought we wanted to own nothing, so we hired a scaffold company to come and build a temporary structure, also to skirt some Chicago code and other things, and then have them take it away. We gilded the scaffold so that if you're in Chicago and you see golden scaffold on any of the buildings, it's because we marked it as participation of the project. And we work with a group called the Southeast Historical Society to make a kind of exhibition space. And they collaborated with us as partners rather than us creating a museum by ourselves. We kind of made this kind of strange hybrid with a lot of different organizations to produce an exhibition in the public way. And the docents from the museum who volunteer their time to tell the story of the ravages of the Vietnam War and the closing of steel plants, which helped to manufacture Chicago, they came out and told their story on site. This was a rehearsal for a project that we wanted to do. Like I said, we're not if you think of a system and its trajectory, we're not an oppositional model because oftentimes that equal and opposite reaction does not get the kind of change that you want. So we've started to take on a kind of oblique or adjacent model and try to change the direction of the particle in space or the system through kind of love and aesthetics rather than counter-revolutionary tactics. I think we are counter-revolutionary. It just doesn't look like that. And to do that, we also changed protocols in the city. So we changed the riverbed by adding these tie-offs for a project that we were doing to float a barge, looking at infrastructure, which crosses lots of communities, all the way from Calumet to Navy Pier. The beauty of infrastructure is it migrates and drifts across space. It doesn't have a permanent territory. So we altered this in order for the project to happen, but now those become leave-behinds as protocols for other people after we activate the site. And floated a barge down the Chicago River with 72 other artists to activate what was an industrial territory into something that is currently turning into cultural territory, except they're selling $22 hamburgers. So to enjoy it, you kind of have to crack your wallet. And our idea was free programming and activating this new infrastructure space in a totally unprecedented way. And now it's becoming a kind of institution. This was more like a circus. It's messy. Its aesthetics are not necessarily, they're intentionally messy and open. It had we would get big crowds when we would park downtown. And performances. So this lasted for 30 days in the state of Chicago. So I am not the only member of Floating Museum. There's Fahim Majid, Jeremiah Huseldo Spofford, and performing right now is Avery R. Young, who's probably our most, he's our rock star in a way. So we have two sculptors, one of whom was the administrator for the Southside Community Arts Center, which was a kind of Bauhaus related space actually in Chicago, but with African American communal relations, and then architect, urbanist, and then we're just the kind of stewards of a huge network that now probably has 150 to 180 people. And the idea is just to kind of continue to build a network of people who share our hallucination. We then, in 2017, activated the Chicago Transit Authority's spaces because it's one of the last democratic spaces in the city. You can't control who you meet on the train. It's kind of porous in that way. It's sort of between public domain and civic realm. And on the left is a diagram of all the people that participate in that project. So it's us, but it's us more choreographing and highlighting work that's already happening horizontally throughout the city of Chicago. So we use the green line to create a network through different neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, and then created a bunch of inflatables and installations to highlight work that's happening on those sites all around Chicago that just doesn't get the attention that the Central Business District gets, because that's focused on tourism. And we activated, by surprise, some trains. So normally, you can find performances on the train, but we actually worked to create legal protocols to make that legitimate, which is a slightly different thing than doing it guerrilla style. And as a counter-revolutionary, we wanted to kind of tweak and bend the rules of the system in order to open up and create more permission for things that should be happening in the city of Chicago. This will make you blow up virally. Like, this is Megan McNeil, who was on The Voice, who performed on one of the trains with her baby, like swaddled to her. And she has a British a music company. So this, at some point, suddenly my phone on one day is just like, because Instagram and Twitter were blowing up, because I think this got 3 million hits from like noon to midnight that night. And it's really because of her. It has nothing to do with really us. She has this huge audience and brings that to the project. We also, make these huge inflatables. This is a kind of floating monument. So we're questioning the permanence of monuments in public realm. It's dedicated to Kitihawa, who was a Potawatomi woman who married a fur trapper whose origin is a little uncertain, but they say Haitian, maybe French Haitian, maybe French. But without that marriage and without that story of love, there wouldn't have been fur trading in the city of Chicago. Without fur trading, there wouldn't be Fort Dearborn. And without Fort Dearborn, there wouldn't be the city of Chicago as you know it today. So in a way, this is a founder's monument, but we kind of like the double-edged notion of founding, meaning creating the origins of something, but if you know about foundering, it's like a kind of precariousness or instability. And we kind of like the doubling of that idea. It's really tall so that you could see it from the train, that these eyes would stare back at you. So this whole thing was about transit activation. And, it pops up really fast, and we could take it down really quickly. So depending on where we are, we now have 3 different inflatables, and they're kind of like drifting activations. They're not about us. Often we use them. Say you're an artist collective making a show in the public park. You can call us and we will bring it for free and pop it up to amplify the work that you're doing. If we do it at the Museum of Science and Industry, sort of like Robin Hood, we charge. That way we can do the other work for free. So we're creating a kind of economic exchange through seduction, You can see it's pretty tall. It looks at you when you're in a train car. To kick that event off, so this is a Logan Monument just after the Civil War. Chicago put up this monument. So initially, and I guess I'm moving to a kind of monument theme, but it moves to it marks a political internal battle in the United States, and it also sort of marks a victory of the North over the South. Strangely, though, in 1968, that monument was also the site of student protests at the Democratic National Convention protesting the Vietnam War, so another war like 100 years later, and a student putting a Viet Cong flag at the top and the police beating everyone. When I first saw this photo, it was inexplicable to me, though, how in a glacier-flattened landscape, all these people are like levitating in the air. And if you go there, you realize this monument is really levitated on a berm, and it is like the height of those garbage cans. So it's just fortuitous that the landscape created this incredible photograph of political unrest. Our show opened 50 years to the day of this photo. So we work with the Chicago Historical Society as a way of activating a collection in public space, extracted all of the images of all the individuals who performed there, and created a kind of double photo. So 50 years in time, kind of flattening. Also, we were feeling at the time some political unrest in the United States that felt a kind of equivalent to the bracket in time from 1968 to 2018. During COVID, the MCA asked us to install, so it was right after George Floyd trauma in the United States, and the museum was going to be empty. So we thought we would put a crowd into the museum as a kind of gesture, as a sculpture. When we were installing, the security guard came up to us and said, "That's me from 50 years ago." So we start to build networks through these activations and aesthetics in space. We're not just Chicago-centric. We also have been working in Malmo and Denmark and now in Ghana. And during COVID, the height of COVID, we sent some work for an exhibition in Malmo, Sweden, and Copenhagen. And then they wanted to have another installation because, despite COVID, like as a way of still continuing an exhibition, asked us as an equivalent institution, even though we're kind of a fake museum. But this is like the Kunstmuseum, Malmo asking Floating Museum to be their parallel partner, which really is interesting about thinking about parallel institutions. And we basically, because we couldn't be inside, use a retail truck that promotes videos to make really weird juxtapositions in public space between, say, damaging of the ecology and Bubbly Creek in Chicago, which is like the site of horrifying industrial damage. So there are these kind of superimpositions of art with public space that also became a video, that also became a series of photographs that we commissioned. So it's like using an exhibition to create more artwork, to create more commentary. And then, strangely, during COVID, the museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, I think out of their own convenience, called us to say, we have this, nothing showing in the photography department. Do you guys want to do your first solo show in the Art Institute of Chicago? Which, of course, you'll say, yes, that we want to do that. But in the photo department. So none of us are photographers, but we're going to do our first show in the photography department. So we had to figure out what that means. Since we tend to change protocols, that's kind of and we tend to change protocols as an adjacent organization, we decided to change the protocols of the Art Institute of Chicago. They have a history of a public gallery and rental space. So if you liked Ed Paschke in 1962, you could go take an Ed Paschke home, hang it on your wall, live with it for a little while, and decide, I think I'd like to buy it, and then go back and buy it from the museum. It was a very privileged structure. It's very wealthy white people doing this in the 50s and 60s, but it was a really weird relationship between an institution of this scale and its general public, and we decided we would want to draw on that in order to seduce them to change their protocols about their relationship to the citizens of Chicago and tourism. We try to get them to give away 387 pieces of art because it's easily reproduced on the published steps. Of course, they said no, but we did get them to give away 10. So the exhibition involves an installation of reproductions of photographs that were sent to residents' houses all over the city of Chicago, from mostly to people who are taking care of other people in their constituent communities, receive free art from the Art Institute of Chicago through conversations about their lives, curated by the photographer, the curators in the photography department as a service. Then we sent and commissioned 10 mid-career photographers whose work would probably end up at that level at some point anyway, but we accelerated their careers to get a commission for them that is now in the Art Institute of Chicago. So now on their CV, they can say they exhibited in the Art Institute. And then we work with the foundations of those 10 artists to give permissions to make reproductions in order to give them away. So there's kind of 3 circles. So we really kind of just went in and made some alchemy. And we were really interested in the domestic. So we worked with the foundations of different artists, depending if they're alive or not. Some artists chose a home, like this is an indigenous, the leader of an indigenous organization in the city of Chicago. Her idea of home is actually the site of an effigy mound that's been erased in the city of Chicago. So some of them are outdoor. Some of them were, brought. This is from Southeast Community. Suzanne teaches about steel mills and the ravages of Vietnam. She received work. Etzer, who is actually the model of our DuSable on our inflatable. It was installed as a series of light boxes, ignoring the space and making our own space within the gallery, and then playing on bellows of old photography machines, but using domestic lighting to light the images. Okay. And the last thing is, because I think of all this municipal work, we were asked to be the curators of the next Chicago Architecture Biennial. But we're not approaching this like a show. We're approaching this like a way for 10 million people, or maybe 80 million people in the region of the Midwest, including you, to rehearse together how we think about the future of our landscape. We're initiating a new way of seeing, there's biennials everywhere. A lot of them reproduce capitalist intentions. They reproduce nationalist stories. And we're not so interested in either of those two things. We're interested in how we together can hallucinate something different that actually serves our needs collectively, not necessarily tourist hotels and banking structures. And so the city of Chicago is produced every day by 10 million people, whether you're cleaning something up or repairing a building or designing something new or remediating a landscape. And so we're thinking about it as a rehearsal, a collective rehearsal for 80 million people. And you can plug into this a number of ways. So if you're thinking about new technology, there's rehearsing of how the technology works. If you're thinking about the structures of voting organization, you might rehearse and get a feedback loop going to understand how those things work. So it's all about constant, perpetual progress. In the past, the exhibition has been largely at the Cultural Center, which is downtown, serves the central business district. And then during COVID, David Brown had a show called The Available City, which pushed, because it needed to be in fresh air, so we didn't exchange virus with each other, out into sites. And we're doing both, treating the Cultural Center as just a node in a horizontal field and activating the city. Plus, because we like to float trains and barges and other things, some roving things that can augment activities that are already happening by really great organizations in the city of Chicago. So highlighting things that are going on and creating a kind of network connection between these things. The sites that we're picking are sites of organizations that can use, say, a pavilion, that know how to maintain it, that know how to program it, rather than what shows have done in the past, which is pop up a pavilion. No one has any maintenance protocol over it. You have to like struggle to program it. We're trying to integrate it into the caretaking of other organizations within the city of Chicago. So some of those sites are like Pop Courts. That's real. That's an Austin corridor in the city of Chicago. It's a kind of quasi public space. The Englewood Nature Trail, which is an ongoing project. So one of the things with the rehearsal is every show doesn't need to be new. It can draw on repetition and the constant progress of a site in an area that needs resources. Up north on Devon, where there's a really largely South Asian community, there's a group named Space Shift trying to create a cultural center for that site. It has no cultural center, no place for people to talk. And then Urban Growers Collective. This is like a big challenging industrial farming and plants as medicine alternatives to pharmaceuticals in the city of Chicago. She has Erica Allen is the owner of this and is trying to create sustainable ways. So we'll pair her up with a commission for a site. And then the cultural center will be activated as a performance venue and object. And so to close, this is always our invitation. You know, I'm one of 4 people. I'm from a community. I don't speak for a community. I speak about interests, and we're really interested in creating relationships beyond the biennial, not just for the biennial. So, you know, as a kind of ambassador of both our work and the biennial, I'm kind of here to invite you all to be continuously in participation with us. You know, if you read William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, we're all part of the same local ecosystem in a way, even though, you know, whatever, 4 hours and 55-minute drive. But that's not, you feed Chicago in Iowa. We're, no, not literally. Or maybe you feed our cars with ethanol. Okay. But either way, we are bound by the same landscape. We are bound by an economy. We are bound by a common question about climate, political instability, and other kinds of things. And so the idea is to create a network of people who share a hallucination and pick away at remediating a kind of difficult history that we live inside of. And with that, thank you. Recently, we had a fundraiser, and the person who hosted it, who gives us a lot of money, said, "I don't normally give money to organizations who turn around and give all my money away to other people," which is what we do. You know, I don't really make any money from Floating Museum, which maybe is problematic. We're trying to have sustainability in our practice. I make money from my design practice and for teaching. But since we are giving money away all the time, and since now we can announce this a prize, I get to also, in the spirit, give more money away, which is nice for me. So thank you for allowing me to do that. And I really want to say also, I've really enjoyed being here. I'm really impressed with the students and level of conversation and level of awareness. You know, in Chicago, we don't talk about this land issue that much, which is insane to me. Maybe because the mythology is stronger. So a couple of things. Kimberly, Peter, and I came up with some criteria, I would say, that for the basis of evaluating the Hansen Prize this year. Basically, did we understand why a project was, what its aims were, what its premise was, why it was doing what it was doing? I would say, what systems or architectural strategies were being organized or manipulated in order to achieve that agenda, and then the nuances of how those things were being manipulated to create spatial sequences, landscape relations. And for me, it was really a delight to see all these students engaging between this kind of blurred boundary between architecture and landscape. I think you would agree that all of the projects were at such a high level that it was super difficult for us to make choices. But, you know, we're charged with a task, so we did our best. But in that spirit of difficulty, there are actually 3 prizes being awarded. So there is a first place and 2 honorable mentions, all of which will receive some pecuniary benefit and the ability to put things on your CV. So we get to give away money. I'll start with the honorable mentions for the sake of climactic presentation. Okay, so 2 honorable mentions. The first one goes to the project titled Buoyancy by Ella Kanageiser and True Million. And the professor was Anna Averson. These honorable mentions will be awarded a $400 prize and some kind of official something, right? A piece of paper? Okay. The second honorable mention goes to Kiana Lechtenberg and Ethan Saul for their project Oak Flow with the professor Kevin Laird. And you also... Can everyone just hum? Okay, thank you. And in first place, with an award of $1,000, with a project titled Coalesce, given to Isabel Witten and Bailey Hewson, Professor Consuelo Nunez. Congratulations.